Humanitarian assistance in Sudan. What is humanitarian assistance? Humanitarian assistance is one of the 4 types of foreign aid. It is aid that is given from one country to another in a time of need. Humanitarian assistance is aid in the form of relief after natural disasters such as hurricanes and earthquakes, and relief after war, which could include giving food to families that have been displaced by war. The U.S. is the largest international donor of humanitarian aid. However, humanitarian aid is the smallest fraction of the U.S.'s foreign aid budget. It is also the least controversial type of foreign aid provided by the U.S.
What conflicts in Sudan caused the need for humanitarian assistance? After Sudan achieved independence from both Egypt and England, many conflicts began in the nation itself. The Civil War of 1983, also known as the North-South War, was one of the biggest conflicts inside of Sudan. This war was over the lack of natural resources that were available in the country, such as food and water. Another large cause of conflict was the Janjaweed, who were a police force put together by the government that burned down villages and killed civilians. These 2 conflicts are the largest causes for the need of humanitarian assistance in Sudan.
What type of humanitarian assistance was given to Sudan? The United States contributed $3.9 billion since 2004 in humanitarian aid to Sudan. U.S. humanitarian aid consists of providing food, shelter, clothing, and medical care to countries in need. Because of limited resources, the United States has to pick what kind of humanitarian aid to send to other countries. This choice is influenced by political and security concerns. Other things, like domestic political priorities and special interest groups, have an effect on this choice as well.
What challenges were presented when trying to provide Sudan with humanitarian assistance? Overall, there have been many challenges when trying to provide Sudan with humanitarian assistance. The Sudan government tightly controls access for all relief groups trying to enter the country and frequently denies access to them. Many of the relief groups that go to Sudan have been attacked or targeted by the Sudan government in an effort to try and stop the aid. Relief workers have also been attacked or harassed, causing organizations to evacuate their staff due to the security issues. Various groups of people in Sudan, in an effort to manipulate the flow of humanitarian aid, have tried to impose their own rules on the relief agencies' work in Sudan. To try and prevent some of these challenges around giving aid to Sudan, the United Nations Security Council and African Union created UNAMID. However, the organization is still underfunded and lacks the resources it needs.
How was Sudan impacted by the humanitarian assistance? Due to the humanitarian assistance provided to Sudan, it was believed by many that the North-South War would only go on for longer, as the government would be able to draw resources from the aid that was being provided. Another way Sudan was impacted by humanitarian aid was the lack thereof at one time. Until June of 2001, the United States refused to provide any assistance to Sudan during the drought that was occurring there. This caused many innocents to die because they did not have the water that they needed to live, while the war continued. Despite these negatives that were caused by humanitarian aid, there were some very strong positives. The people of Sudan were provided with much of the resources which they had very little of, such as food and assistance with livelihood, once the U.S. did grant humanitarian aid. Lastly, those who suffered from flooding and other disasters, such as disease, were also provided with help.
Was the humanitarian assistance helpful? Many critics argue that food supplied by the humanitarian aid caused more problems because it is thought to have prolonged the North-South Civil War. The United States also refused many types of humanitarian aid that could have helped Sudan. The U.S. didn't provide aid to drought victims because they believed it would allow the government to acquire more resources in the war. While the U.S. had good intentions to not want to aid in the war, opponents argued that not giving this aid caused innocents to die while the government continued to gather resources without the help of the drought relief. The U.S. also prohibited foreign oil companies doing business in Sudan. These companies argued that they could cause positive change in Sudan by providing clean water, education, and medication.
What are the controversies surrounding humanitarian assistance in Sudan? Although humanitarian assistance is the least controversial form of foreign aid, it still has some controversy surrounding it, specifically in Sudan. Many have argued that the humanitarian aid of food and supplies have prolonged the North-South Civil War. Along with this, up until June of 2001, the U.S. had refused to supply humanitarian aid to drought victims in the government-controlled North, believing the aid would provide the government with more war resources. However, many have argued against this, saying that denying aid would only let innocent people die while the civil war continued because food and famine have been constantly used as a weapon of war. Another controversy about the aid in Sudan is that by doing oil business in Sudan, it will harm foreign oil companies. The foreign oil companies argue against this, saying that their business provides a force for positive change through the clean water, education, and medicine that they give to Sudan.
Did the humanitarian assistance have an overall positive or negative effect on Sudan? Overall, humanitarian assistance had a positive effect on Sudan, although there were many negatives that stemmed from the assistance. Relating to humanitarian assistance, the United States gave around $3.9 billion to Sudan, which was used to provide those who lived there with some of the basic things they needed to survive, such as food, water, housing, etc. One of the biggest positive impacts of humanitarian assistance was how using the $6 million given by the U.S. for humanitarian assistance specifically focused on reconstruction, Sudan was able to rebuild itself much quicker.
How should humanitarian assistance be used in the future? As long as foreign aid organizations take into account frequent issues that occur with humanitarian aid, it has the capability to be helpful to a country in need. Humanitarian aid provides food, shelter, clothes, and medication. The issue with this is that these resources can sometimes do more harm to the country, as argued with Sudan during the North-South Civil War. Another issue with these resources is that they can halt the economy of the country if provided too often or for too long. A solution around these problems is for the foreign aid companies to have more communication with the country in need, so it actually gets what it needs.
Where is Sudan now? On July 9, 2011, the Republic of South Sudan became the world's newest nation and the 55th country in Africa. Since then, many things have changed. About 82% of South Sudan's population is poor, and economic crisis and food insecurities continue to affect millions. On October 25, 2021, a military takeover happened in Sudan, which killed and injured many of the civilians. Incidents of violence have significantly increased since 2020, and the COVID-19 pandemic has had extreme negative effects on Sudan. According to the 2022 Sudan Humanitarian Needs Overview, about 14.3 million people living in Sudan will need humanitarian aid in 2022. Despite all the negative things happening in Sudan, there have been some positive changes. The HPR plan was put into effect to help reduce humanitarian needs and allow Sudan to advance towards sustainable development. The HPR plan will provide response to recurring floods, conflict, and disease outbreaks, along with support to the most vulnerable and prioritizing life-sustaining services. Due to the HPR plan, about 5 million people have received food and livelihoods assistance, and 2.4 million now have access to health services. These are our works cited.